Welcome back, everyone. Hi, Dave. Thanks for chairing, Dave. Dave Weimer is here to take on the final panel of today. He's our curator of maps and many other things, and I'll let him take it from here. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. I'm so glad to see so many of you here. As Leah said, I'm the curator of maps and director of the Center for the History of Cartography at the Newberry. And I'm super happy to chair this paper about colonial bodies and mapping. So the I will not be introducing folks, but their bios will be put in the chat and are available on the World Wide Web. So without further ado, we'll start with Arianna.
Hi, thank you so much, Dave. First, I just want to say thank you to Yasmin and everybody at the Newberry for putting this together. It's been such a fascinating day, and I'm just really appreciative for all the work you guys put in to make this space for us. So, without further ado, I will share my screen and get started. Only 17 years after the capture of Brazil by the Dutch, and 7 years before they lost it again, the humanist writer Caspar Barlaeu wrote a rather lengthy encomium to the governorship of Count Johann Maurits van Nassau-Siegen, entitled The Rerum per octennium in Brasilia, and the frontispiece is what you see on the left here. Barlaeu paints a fairly rosy picture of Dutch Brazil in 1647 as well-governed, well-ordered, and unified, only occasionally mentioning the famine, social unrest, and poverty that in actuality plagued the colony. The book opens with an overview of Brazil's landscape, flora, fauna, and inhabitants, accompanied by the series of maps shown here that I will be discussing today. They are based on the drawings of Franz Post, a painter best known for his spatially strange landscapes, and the geographic work of Georg Markgraf, both of whom accompanied the governor to Brazil. As Elizabeth Sutton has argued, the maps here materially and symbolically assert Dutch possession of Brazil by highlighting the infrastructure and labor that was undertaken at their behest. But before we start to look to printmaking as a medium of naturalizing enslavements, I want to briefly take us on a tour through Dutch Brazil. The first map we encounter is the Captaincy of Seri, framed by a swag with some tropical fruits and occupied by a jaguar and capybara. The next introduces us to Pernambuco, the seat of government in Dutch Brazil. This first map of Pernambuco is divided in diagonal thirds depicting water, land, and labor. The small vignette at the right of a group of Africans fishing also appears in the distant background of fellow Dutch-Brazilian artist Albert Eckhout's painting, African Woman with Child. The following map concludes the depiction of Pernambuco and Itamaraca. Here, the dominant element of the map is quite clearly the sugar mill and the infrastructure of slavery. The final map at last includes indigenous peoples of Brazil and the captaincies of Paraíba and Rio Grande, where Elias Herkmans leads a contingent of Brazilians along the Mongaguaba River into the forested interior. Although he also brought 40 soldiers from the Dutch West India Company, they are not depicted here as part of his retinue. In the text that follows, Barlaeu consistently describes and discusses enslaved Africans in terms of numbers. The numbers brought in ships to Brazil, the prices their trafficking fetched, and the profit their labor provided. In the two maps of Pernambuco, such bodies of African figures are shown as filled with sloppy slashed lines created by the printmaking technique of etching. Now, etching had only begun to be theorized in writing in the mid-17th century by art theorists. The first tract to address the process of etching was published by printmaker Abraham Bossa in 1645, in which Bossa declares that the greatest possible accomplishment in etching is the successful imitation of engraving. Now, the two are in fact created quite differently. In engraving, a burin is pushed through the copper plate and displaces the metal. The ink is then put into the empty lines, extracted from plate to paper, through the process of the printing press, and that's what you see here from left to right. In etching, the copper plate is coated with a layer of wax, and a thin instrument called a needle is used to sketch lines that expose the copper underneath. The whole plate is then dipped into a vat of acid, which eats away at the exposed metal, which then becomes the lines. In general, etching is much more akin to drawing, given the relative lack of resistance the needle faces in moving through the wax. Now, the figures here transparently do not imitate engraving. And this image on the right, I am providing to show you what can be accomplished by engraving and the difference in the quality of line between etching and engraving. The figures are instead loose shapes filled with loose lines to indicate their skin color. Many of the figures appear to melt into the structures that surround them. Take, for example, the man that stands next to the mill owner on the balcony of his home, which can be seen in the detail at right. House and man are both etched in thin parallel lines and ultimately blend together, both property to the white owner. The intention of this etching was not necessarily to be the sort of elevated art object prized by Vos, but to communicate something essential about Brazil, about slavery, and about Blackness. Throughout both maps, the African figures are featureless, as the etched lines continue uninterrupted between skin and hair. Faces are seldom specified by more than a few dashed marks and obscured by the black ink where they are present at all. The way that the printmaker employed the etching technique consequentially obliterates the individuality of the figures. Gouverneur Maurits, for whom these maps were made, had a personal investment in the continuation of the slave trade. Carolina Montero and Eric Odegaard have demonstrated that he was involved in smuggling slaves for personal profit. And a small sketch from Zacharias Wagner's Tierbuch, and Wagner was another Dutch-Brazilian artist, includes a woman who is branded with Maurits's monogram, which can also be found on the frontispiece of the Rerum. The dehumanization of the figures thus serves Maurits's purpose, and etching specific characteristics enabled the subsequent conceptualization of Blackness that the prints enact. Etching sketching quality, when embraced as we see here, further has the effect of producing a feeling of direct observation. This sense of authenticity, founded on first-hand observation, was increasingly valued in European epistemology, and lent the maps a sense of credibility. Yet we have a drawing by Franz Post that likely served as the template for one of the maps. Drawn in ink and colored in with gray wash, there are a few notable compositional differences, including the presence of a European in the space of the mill. At far right, a Dutch or Portuguese man is flanked by two enslaved workers. He seems to carry a sword, wear a hat, and don traditional period clothing. The level of detail is striking compared to the individual immediately to the left of him, whose face is literally blank. At left, a figure stands atop a hay cart in the drawing, but bends down and disappears into the lines of the mill and the etching. Essentially, the drawing was modified to better suit etching and the visual illusion that could be made through etching between the enslaved and the infrastructure of Brazil. Barlaeus's map was not intended to be an accurate representation of Brazil. It's a justification for Maurits's success and the necessity of slavery. The enslaved Black bodies are made to be fungible. Their gender is invisible, as are their faces and their individuality. And I want to be clear that when I say Black bodies, I am being literal in the sense that these are bodies made of black ink, which itself contributed to the othering and racializing power of etching. Ink had often been connected to the appearance of Afro-diasporic peoples in European writings, both serious and playful. In one scientific experiment that is designed to, quote, make men seem like blackamoors, author Giambattista della Porta instructs, quote, take ink, mingle this with your lamps, and the flame will be black, and make the standers by as black as Ethiopians, end quote. Dutch author Simon Wittgees similarly advised his readers that, for a fun practical joke, they could become as black as Moors by patting their faces with towels soaked in ink. With lines and with ink then, Barlaeus and the printmakers used etching specificities as a tool to efface and racialize the real Afro-diasporic people that were trafficked across the Atlantic and suggest their fundamental fungibility. Against dozens of Indigenous and Black figures, there are only a total of 3 European figures in all 4 of these maps, only one of whom is known to be Dutch. By associating non-whiteness with the cartographic space of the Americas, the maps contribute to the racialization of these figures as outside the bounds of European humanity. Etching sketchiness served this purpose particularly well, making slavery, and Blackness in particular, intrinsic to the space of colonial Brazilian cartography. But I am also interested in what can be read between inked lines, so to speak, into what colonial art objects can reveal unintentionally. To this end, I want to end my presentation by briefly introducing the work of Catherine McKittrick, particularly as regards her book, Demonic Grounds, Black Women and the Cartography of Struggle, in which McKittrick explores how Black geographies can be uncovered beneath the geographies of domination that have sought to render subaltern spaces invisible. McKittrick states succinctly at the beginning that, quote, Black matters are spatial matters. More in depth, she writes, The relationship between Black populations and geography allows us to engage with a narrative that locates and draws on Black histories and Black subjects in order to make visible social lives which are often displaced, rendered ungeographic. If space and place appear to be safely secure and unwavering, then what space and place make possible, outside and beyond tangible stabilities and from the perspective of struggle, can potentially fade away. This is, I think, precisely what Barlaeus's maps aim to do. This was not the truth of the matter, and many involved in the creation of maps like these knew that. But of course, that was not the point, for how many of its viewers could have gone to Brazil, witnessed how the Dutch relied upon their indigenous allies, negotiated with Portuguese planters, struggled against the tropical climates, and were faced with resistance from enslaved Africans. All of this is fruitfully summed up in one community that these maps do render deliberately ungeographic, with its location obscured in the map by the vignette of the sugar mill, the Quilombo dos Palmares. The Quilombo was the largest fugitive community in Brazilian history, surviving for nearly 100 years in the forested interior that the vignettes disguise. The Dutch attempted several times to eradicate the Quilombo, whose residents regularly raided and traded with people on the edge of the forest and the coastline. The Palmarinos, made up primarily of fugitive Africans, but also of indigenous peoples and others who were oppressed, were protected by their knowledge of the land and the use of the natural fortifications that their geographic position lent them. In essence, this predominantly Black multi-ethnic community created their own space, a space that was not and could not be captured in colonial cartography. The Quilombo's history reveals the alternative conceptualizations of space and the spatializations of Blackness that belie what the etched lines of Barlaeus's map sought to make visible and true. Etching's visual tricks, its sketchy qualities, its inky lines, could not in reality paper over the space of the Quilombo where fugitives went free. Thank you very much for your time.
Great. Thank you so much. Many claps. Many claps. Next we'll have Elisa.
Hi, thank you so much for having me today, and thank you for this wonderful organization. It's been amazing, the conference so far. So we'll be talking about mapping race through Indigenous Arctic FishSkin artifacts, exploration, assimilation, and ethnic negation. I would like to start by stating that I'm a non-Indigenous research associate at the Smithsonian Arctic Studies Center, and that I document FishSkin traditions using an Indigenous research methodology. And this approach is rooted in the wisdom, the cultures, and lived experience of Indigenous communities, emphasizing a decolonizing perspective that centers the voices of Indigenous elders as primary sources, while respecting their cultural protocols and knowledge systems. Despite assimilation, discrimination, and the almost complete disappearance of cultural practices, a distinct ethnicity has persisted in all the Arctic and subarctic Indigenous groups, with historical evidence of FishSkin production. These are the Inuit, the Yupik, the Alutiiq and Athabascan of Alaska, the Ulchi, Nivk, and Nanai peoples from Siberia, the Ainu from Hokkaido Island in Japan and Sakhalin Island in Russia, the Hertze from Northeast China, and the Sami of Northern Scandinavia. These cultures are within a considerable distance of each other and have had both similar access to natural resources and comparable needs in terms of clothing. The geographical distance would have led one to expect little contact between these groups, at least historically. However, the study of the literature of all these communities shows that most Indigenous groups interacted with each other in exchange networks that stretch across the natural border of the Amur River between Northeast China and Siberia to present-day Sakhalin, Hokkaido, and eventually Alaska. These cultures were originally hunter-fisher-gatherers, and they placed primary importance on fish as resource, since it provided food to support their families. The relationship with salmon played an important role in maintaining their identities, creating important ties with the environment. Salmon not only nurtured their body, but also their soul. And despite the importance of salmon to all these Arctic Indigenous peoples, the traditional subsistence fishing rights were abolished by the assimilation policies pursued by the Japanese to the Ainu, the Russians and Americans to Alaska Native peoples, the Chinese to the Hertze, and the Russians to the Nivka Nanai. Arctic indigenous groups lost their access to their traditional fishing grounds. Subsistence salmon fishing was not allowed, and salmon fishing in the rivers was considered illegal until recent times. Now focusing on Alaska Native peoples and FishSkin. Pre-contact Alaska Native sites preserved in extensive permafrost, they showcase an intricately differentiated assemblage of material culture. The wide range of often delicate craft items such as gut skin, bird skin, and fish skin parkas, or even sinew thread, owes only partly to the exceptional preservation conditions of these archaeological sites. Alaska Native inhabited an environment intentionally enriched with the results of their ingenuity and craftsmanship. And unlike many other small-scale, highly mobile societies that emphasize technological simplicity to reduce the burden of constant production and transportation, Inuit culture embraced a complex and creative material repertoire. The Alaska Native adaptation to the environment of the Arctic was grounded in the approach of anticipating every possible scenario and layering extensive material to shield themselves from a sometimes hostile natural world. This strategy relied on the mastery of tools and techniques to exploit a diverse array of animal materials. These materials included bone, antler, ivory, horn, skin, hair, sinew, baleen, feathers, gut, and fish skin. The technology and artistry of pre-contact clothing was the most complex of any documented hunter-gatherer group. With the abundance of fish in the Alaskan rivers and with the native people's close affinity to the land and its resources, it followed naturally for fish skin to become widely used as a fabric and accessories. And after the flesh was eaten, seamstress took care of the inedible remains of fish with innovation. Alaska Native women used salmon skins to sew clothes, boots, mittens, bags, blankets, and tents. We can understand fish skin technology as an assemblage of fish and plant species, weather conditions, material qualities, and climates of places and peoples. These artifacts also highlight the rich cultural ecology of Arctic indigenous groups and their interactions with nature. Despite the common perception of the Arctic as a place of mere survival, the abundance of archaeological material suggests the historical wealth of the region and the flourishing of transcontinental trade among Arctic native nations long before European contact. The arrival of the Russians in Southwest Alaska in 1741 significantly affected the Alutiiq natives. Native culture was flourishing and at its peak after evolving for 7,000 years. Europeans, primarily Russians or those in their employ, reached Southwest Alaska concentrating on fur trading, particularly for sea otter pelts. Russians exploited native labor for their mammal hunting expertise, which the Russians lacked, and they banned indigenous hunting and processing of furs destined for the commercial market. They exhausted all the Alaska Native fur skin resources, and local seamstresses were forced to rely on skins with little value to the export fur trade, particularly fish skins and bird skins, to make their own clothes. Inuit and European contact was a slow and discontinuous process that transformed Alaska society over the last 450 years of interaction around gathering activity, interregional trade, and social differentiation. Historical records provide information of fish skin artifacts collected between 1740 and 1920 by explorers and missionaries. They're stored in distant natural history cabinets symbolizing cultural heritage laws. These artifacts illuminate the migration from the south to the north, where Europeans realized further expansion into Arctic climates, recognizing that the peoples of the north cultures were much more complex than they had been perceived in medieval times. Explorers noted the superb adaptation that Arctic natives have made with clothes designed for Nordic climates, and at the same time, the success of any polar exploration was contingent of the relations developed with native peoples or the lack of them. Many collections artifacts are tied to colonialistic expansions. One form of tangible appropriation of cultural heritage is the removal of an object for the community or artist that originated it, exemplified by the accumulation of indigenous artifacts in museums during the colonial era. The history of material trade intermingles design traditions found in these objects, many of which are objects of great beauty and craftsmanship, but with a story behind of conquest with the European quest for control of land and markets. Museums of natural history, ethnography, and anthropology have long curated collections of Arctic belongings aimed to document what was wrongly believed to be vanishing cultures. Over time, the focus of these museums has evolved from categorization to environmental awareness while facilitating native access to the cultural heritage. The provenance of Arctic artifacts in Western museums is linked to colonial legacies, resulting in a disconnect between native communities and their material heritage. Recently, museum collections are going through a decolonizing process, examining the acquisitions, display methods, while honoring the cultures they represent. Exploring indigenous approaches to subsistence practices, food security, and food sovereignty is crucial in preserving cultural continuity for future generations. Adopting a framework to decolonize land management and ownership is essential for Alaska Natives to reclaim their subsistence rights and cultural heritage for generations to come. The role of FishSkin artifacts and the social activities around them reinforces the native identities in subsistence-based social structures. A conversation between pre-modern race studies and Arctic indigenous studies highlights the intertwined ecological, spiritual, and material practice of Alaska Natives while addressing colonialism legacies. And I would like to end with a phrase by the late Smithsonian anthropologist Ernest Burge. The archaeologists do not believe anything that is not manifested in stone tools or middens. The historians do not believe anything that was not written down on paper by a contemporary observer. And the ethnographers do not believe anything they have not seen with their own eyes. Ironically, but perhaps appropriately, many natives do not believe archaeological, historical, or ethnographic accounts of traditional native life when made by Euro-Americans, unless they are corroborated by the oral testimony of elders. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really interesting. All right. Next up, we have Brandon.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen really quickly here. Okay, can everyone see the PowerPoint? Great, thank you so much. My name is Brandon Dunlevy, and I just want to thank everybody at the Newberry and all of my fellow presenters for being here and for organizing this great event. It's great to be with so many other scholars of race studies and pre-modernity. I'll be presenting an analysis of a Spanish colonial freedom trial that I translated some years back with a transcription from Dr. Christina Lee at Princeton University for a senior thesis. This is a case from 16th century Seville, where indigenous people in the Spanish Empire were given rights to sue for their freedom from slavery in 1542, some 30 years prior to the case taking place. This case is unique because it demonstrates an ethnically Asian man passing as a Native American, or Indio, as they were referred to at the time, thereby challenging Spaniards' understanding of their own narrow conception of what Indios look like across the colonial empire at the time. I would like to open with a rare notarial quote from the complainant, Diego Indio, a man who claimed to have been born in the Spanish region of China sometime in the early 1500s. This was a century where tens of thousands of indigenous Americans, Asians, and Africans were brought as slaves to Iberia, most of which never returning to see their homelands ever again. He tells of this account of being enslaved by first a Catholic priest and then a private owner within the peninsula, and enduring brutality and ridicule at the time of this complaint for saying that he is a free man before the court. As you can see in the upper right corner, I have an example of what this case looks like. And then I have like this quote, and I'm just going to read it out loud because I believe it is very powerful. And Diego Indio said to the court, "And when the ship docked, I was taken in by a shoemaker, and he kept me under his power for 10 years, teaching me the trade of shoemaking. And afterwards, a priest named Juan de Morales tricked me by saying he would send me back to my native land, and he brought me instead to Seville for what is going on for 6 or 7 years. And now in this past fleet that is going to the mainland, he left me and sold me to Rodrigo Alonso, a merchant living in Candilejo, a neighborhood of Seville, without me even knowing or understanding this. And now he has already given me such bad treatments, even making me wear an iron collar. And so I come before you, gentlemen, over being treated in such a manner, knowing that I am free. He claims to have been born in Limpoa, China, or modern-day Ningpo, where there was a prior Portuguese contact at this time, but no record of Spanish strongholds like in the Philippines. This case lasts 3 years, and it especially presents as complex as it is compiled out of order, likely having been copied 2 or 3 times, and it features 2 trials, one being from the Casa de la Contratación, or the House of Trade in Seville, which governed the trade in the Spanish Empire, and the second one being from the ecclesiastical courts because his first owner was a priest. Diego asserts that he ended up in the care of a cobbler after being bought as a child, and he's lured by this priest from Lisbon to Seville across the empire, across borders, under the guise of more Chinese people being in Seville and the possibility of returning to his homeland. He's unknowingly enslaved by the priest upon doing so. Finally, this priest goes to the Americas, selling Diego and putting him in the custody of Rodrigo Alonso, a previously unknown man, an owner who makes him do manual labor and wear an iron collar in public. In the end, Diego Indio is freed. I thought I should mention that up front. But I'm more interested in the discourse that takes place in this case and how it applies to race studies and premodernity. So to begin, we have some competing narratives of origin here. What I care to analyze from this case are those, and how this helps us understand racial hierarchies that were developing at the time within Spain and those abroad, as well as the physical phenotypes that the European psyche was associating with Indios of the Spanish Empire. This differed from places like the Philippines, where the Spanish had strongholds, versus the Portuguese in Goa, for example. And those enslaved people would not have legal standing in a Spanish court because those places were not claimed by the same empire. There is a tale of Diego and his friends that he has made, other enslaved people within Sevilla, being smuggled by a Nicaraguan governor to Lisbon with a pirate attack, a shipwreck, and eventually landing in Lisbon, and he's taken in by that first cobbler. However, the priest Juan de Morales, who Diego claims tricked him to cross the border into slavery from Portugal, claims that he simply bought Diego from a market in Goa and possessed him in Mozambique before that. So as you can see, we have two competing narratives of origin, one from Diego Indio and many of the other enslaved indigenous people who testify, and then we have the one from the priest and the second owner who he was sold to, Rodrigo Alonso. Either way, something is amuck here, something's not adding up, and we have 2 competing claims. I use the critical framework of the Trans-Imperial Indio as presented by Nancy Van Dusen in her book Global Indios, as well as a case summary by scholar Juan Gil in the Trans-Pacific Studies Guides by Christina Lee and Ricardo Padron. Padron's book, especially The Indies of the Setting Sun, is very pertinent to the project as he maps the Spanish Philippines into colonial Latin America. I seek to find out from this case how overseas geographical knowledge and minority agency within the metropolis of Spain manifest together before authority figures and within the public record. How do Indigenous, Asian, and African people vouch for one another? And how do they speak in private outside the courtroom versus on the public record? I analyzed this case via discourse present in the testimonies and witness interrogations in which the themes of physiognomy, autochthony, and clandestine agency emerge as the main figure of proving Diego Indio's freedom, whether he was born under the Spanish law or not, and how his phenotype plays into this determination. In the discourse of physiognomy, we see in the questions that are asked to witnesses on both sides, from the Christian Spaniards to the converted Indios living in Seville, a special focus on Diego Indio's head shape, on his skin color, on his mannerisms that he uses to address others, and this may distinguish him as being Indian, as in from India, versus ethnically Chinese, as he claims. The course must rely on expert witnesses from slave traders and from New World sailors of lower classes who have seen the Indies in order for Morales and Alonso to make their claims. They call Diego other names besides Indio discursively, including esclavo or slave, morisco or chile, all of which could throw off his claim of being an Indio, and therefore making him enslavable. He is compared to other enslaved peoples and communities of the Portuguese Empire to discredit his blood origin being in China. In the second example of autochthony, we see a plethora of fellow indigenous people claiming to be Indios from China on the same boat that Diego was taken on as a child when he was brought to Europe, which is either a miraculous truth and all these people did know each other, or as I interpret it, it could be mutual support from fellow enslaved people who saw an opportunity to anchor themselves within this case and create future legal precedent by using the case of Diego Indio to free themselves later on. You know, getting one person freed would allow them to be freed as well if they can establish they were all on the boat at the same time illegally being smuggled as children. These indigenous witnesses even claim to the Spanish courts that all Indios are the same, from Peru to China, and that they all speak the same language. This would make it more likely for Diego Indio to be seen as close to Latin American and therefore free. In these arenas where borders were murky and few people had gone, it's much easier to set precedent due to lack of broader knowledge of local citizens and the things that were present in those faraway lands. The interrogations even included a test for Diego Indio, where he was asked to name off local fruits from his province of China, during which he mentions the longan fruit and the lychee fruits. Anything he cannot recall is simply brushed off due to him being a young child at the time when he was smuggled to Europe by the governor of Nicaragua, and then the whole thing setting forward from the priest to the second owner at the time of this case. And then the third example of clandestinity, in this discourse, I argued that the lens of critical speculation that Diego's witnesses had to have had rehearsed testimonies behind the scenes. The amount of cross-referentiality that is within these cases, most enslaved people are claiming to know each other within this case. The testimonials mention each other, they mention their conversions, they mention knowing each other as children. And this attests to Diego Indio's character and his status as either a slave or a free man. Some also even tell of checking on Diego Indio during the days of the trial when he was made to work in the galleys as punishment for going to the court and wearing an iron collar and chain. Also, several African enslaved men from Mozambique and Angola and other territories that were under the Portuguese Empire also sabotaged their own testimonies by giving unreasonable travel times between colonial territories, stating that places like Mozambique and India are much closer than they were, or places across Latin America are much further than they were. And this gets their expertness sort of taken away so that their testimony is disqualified. This may have been an intentional move to disqualify their statement, thereby making Diego Indio seem more innocent simply due to testimony counts. Finally, thank you for your time, and I look forward to discussing further.
Great, thank you. Thank you, perfect timing. And last but not least, we have Miriam.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Thank you so much. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Okay, can you see it? Okay, thank you. And first of all, thank you so much to the organizers of this wonderful symposium. I have enjoyed the presentation so much, and I'm looking forward to the ones tomorrow. And just a very quick warning about the language that my primary sources use that can be very violent and quite triggering, and I'm still trying to navigate this issue. So I would like to share part of my dissertation work, and to start with a story from the late 17th century, when an Italian Capuchin named Marcellino d'Atri was attempting to cross the Nkisi River in West Central Africa while traveling across the Kingdom of Congo. And this was actually proving to be quite a difficult feat due to some misunderstanding between his small group and the local boatmen. Remembering his frustration in a later account, the Capuchin described the boatman in these terms, quote, "With his deformed face and black skin, he looked like Charon when with his boat on the Stygian swamp, he carries the souls to the other's life," end quote. This short sentence encapsulates the boatman as a demonic monster, associating his blackness with ideas of deformity and monstrosity that would have been familiar to a European reader. The missionary was describing one of many instances of conflict and misunderstanding between Italian missionaries and West Central African people. However, in order to reinforce his assumptions about the boatman's unreasonable and childish behavior, the Italian Capuchin chose to focus his description on the monstrous body of the boatman as a powerful metaphor for his lack of reason and civility. So in this short presentation today, I would like to examine how European perceptions of bodily differences and ideas of monstrosity shaped the 17th and 18th century Italian missionaries' encounter with West Central African people, and contributed to broader European processes of construction of an African identity. And in doing so, I hope to illuminate the role of different cultural European traditions that shaped how Italian missionaries observed the African body and portrayed their encounter with West Central African people. On the one hand, we can see the impact of a long tradition of classic ideas about the existence of monstrous races, which were incorporated in European travel literature. These ideas also continue to shape Renaissance perceptions of bodily differences and physical impairments as part of the category of monstrosity. On the other hand, we can also see how these missionary writings were influenced by Catholic discourses about bodily appearance as a reflection of the soul. One more recent historiography has focused on recovering the experiences of African people in Renaissance Italy and analyzing early modern processes of race-making. Little attention has been paid to how these processes unfolded during interactions between Italian and African people in the African continent, and to the role played by perceptions of physical differences. My research follows Italian Capuchins who started to arrive in West Central Africa in 1645. Their presence had been requested by the King of Congo since the kingdom had converted to Christianity by the late 15th century. The Capuchins' aim was to reinforce such conversion according to Catholic Reformation ideas and to spread it among neighboring countries. And in this context, one of their main aims was to target what they considered as diabolic and pagan practices. While reporting their activities and preparing future missionaries, the Capuchins also recorded the experiences and encounters with what they considered as sorcerers or leaders of diabolic cults, and more generally with people that resisted their Christianizing efforts. And it's interesting to note how it is precisely while describing these difficult encounters that the Capuchins presented the African body as monstrous, deformed, and inherently different, as a powerful visual metaphor of a supposed lack of morality, reason, and civilization. And I really want to stress here that this is just one part of the story, since the Capuchins also described African people as good-natured, beautiful, and strong, but this happened especially when they welcomed the missionaries' presence and converted to Christianity. And I want to give you another brief example of the language used to describe these moments of conflicts. And this example comes from another late 17th century account by Francisco Maria Gioia. After describing the suggestions given to the Queen of Matamba to curb the barbaric customs of her people, such as anthropophagy, the Capuchin offers a comparison between African people who had yet to convert to Christianity and animals or non-human beings. He claims, quote, "No one should be surprised that I call these black Ethiops beastly men. And may I not with impunity, after glimpsing in them so little humanity that they resemble so many beasts, call them semi-humans, present them as so many satyrs or centaurs, and freely say of each one of them that he is half human, half god, and wholly a beast." End quote. As Marcellino Datri, Gioia too was drawing from classic mythological ideas of half human and half beast beings to reinforce his denunciation of the supposed cruelty and savagery of African people who had not converted to Christianity. As we have seen in both cases, the Capuchins' writings reveal their familiarity with classic ideas of monstrous races inhabiting faraway regions of the world, such as the yet unexplored internal regions of West Central Africa. Notably, blackness itself had also figured in European Renaissance imagination among the category of monstrosity, and monstrosity at this point in time is a very broad and shifting concept, encompassing a variety of physical features and experiences of impairment that were considered both abnormal and wondrous. By emphasizing the black skin of their opponents, the Capuchins were reinforcing European perceptions of blackness as a marker of a monstrous difference. At the same time, the missionaries' writings show how blackness was also associated with the evil and the demonic, linking it to specific religious discourses about the purity of the soul and whether or not it could inhabit a black body. In fact, after describing the hellish country of another non-Christian and particularly fierce group called Jaga in the text, Joya again concluded his observations by equating them to diabolic demons. Quote, I say that the inhabitants themselves, the Jagi Ethiopians who live there, are demons as they in fact resemble demons for the deformity of their faces, demons for their blackness, end quote. In these cases, it's interesting to note how the Italian missionaries not only highlighted blackness as a marker of difference, but reinforced the supposed authority of African people considered as untrustworthy by describing them as deformed, beastly, or ugly. And at other times, these people are also labeled as blind or deaf to the Christian message. This kind of language, even if it is vague, reveals the role of European perceptions of physical differences, including experiences of impairment that would now be recognized as forms of disability, to observe and categorize the African body. And here I also wanted to briefly mention the role of physiognomy as a broad Renaissance cultural and artistic tradition that paid attention to people's physical features as a reflection of their inner values and qualities. So in the eyes of Italian missionaries, African people became monstrous, deformed, or impaired whenever they displayed what they considered as pagan and therefore uncivilized behavior, generally associated with diabolic influence and lack of reason. And so to conclude, I hope to have shown that Italian missionary writings from West Central Africa can reveal the importance of physical appearance as a categorizing tool in the process of construction of an African authority. They also reveal how European ideas of monstrosity, deformity, and bodily differences shaped the encounter between Italian missionaries and African people in the African continent, and eventually contributed to broader European discourses of race-making that have had a long impact today. Thank you very much for this.
Great, thank you. Thank you all to the whole panel. What do we think? Are we doing, can someone who's actually in charge tell me if we should do questions through me or questions?
We can take questions from the Q&A, or people who are panelists can feel free to pop in. So feel free to contribute in any way possible. You can take questions amongst each other first, or Dave, you can go ahead in.
Do any of our panelists have questions for each other? I have one question to start for, that I was going to ask Arianna, which is how you think those maps would be different as engravings rather than etchings?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that I mean, it's hard to tell in a PowerPoint, but these maps are like really quite large. They're not like baby maps. They're pretty sizable, so it's not necessarily impossible that it could have been an engraving, that an engraving would have been much more detailed or much more naturalistic in the way that we think about the depiction of bodies or of skin of the Africans or of Indigenous people or of the Europeans. Etching was faster and it was cheaper. So there is some sort of irony, I think, in the fact that this was an extremely expensive book, and the maps that begin the book were done in etching rather than engraving. But I think that if it was done in engraving, there would be some different associations that I would be trying to make between the figures and the printmaking technique. As I mentioned, like etching, because it has the sketchy quality, it does allude to this idea of witnessing, but the printmaker was not actually in Brazil. Only Post, from whom he got the drawings, is in Brazil. So you have this sort of, effacement of the distance that is actually being made between the print and what was happening in Brazil. That is completely denied both by Barlaeus's text and by just kind of the lack of information that is given around these maps. So the fact that it's an etching, I think, really contributes to this way that I think the maps are kind of playing with you, and that the whole book is kind of playing with you. I should also mention that these maps are 4 of something like 50 images in this book. All the rest of them are sort of like landscapes. So they're also performing a very specific function, being at the very beginning of the book. And the other prints, they do incorporate some engraving. The maps are pretty much solely etching, but the other prints do have both engraving and etching. And they're also much more nuanced in the way that they depict the bodies. So I think the fact that it's purely etching and that it's being done in this way with the maps at the beginning of the book is really significant for the way that they're trying to construct Brazil more broadly.
That's really interesting, Arianna. And I'm just wondering the fact that they didn't have the models right in front of them, because I mean, they were doing them in Europe. So probably that was also the fact that they couldn't even get the details on top of all the racist issues that you have brought forward as well. But I'm thinking of like also like Renaissance paintings with the children. They look like adults as well, because probably they didn't have many children to paint directly from. So I'm wondering if that could have been an aspect as well.
It could be. There was actually quite a large African population in Amsterdam, a large Afro-diasporic population that lived in the same neighborhood as the artists. It's not entirely sure where the specific potential printmakers lived within Amsterdam, but they were pretty visible. They show up in notarial documents. Some of them were servants to Sephardic Jews who had fled Iberia to Amsterdam at the beginning of the 17th century, but there was also a free population. And you have some sketches from artists like Rembrandt of this Afro-diasporic population. So it's certainly possible that part of the problem was that the printmakers did not have like a real body in front of them. But you know, it's one of multiple possibilities as to why it ended up being shown this way, in my opinion.
Seinan has their hand up if her hand up if you want to go.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yes, thank you. So my question is also for Arianna, and I love that you presented on this because it's a question I do English literature, and I didn't really think about images before until I was at the Folger this summer, and I was looking at Richard Knowles's book, and I saw these like pictures of sultans printed on the book. And then I thought, playwrights use this book as a like as their source. I wonder if like those images influenced the, staging. And then I found myself in this rabbit hole of pictures of Ottoman sultans in early printed books. But because it's not my expertise, I'm still like trying to understand, the technology and the methodology. And I'm questioning, how do we observe and also draw the line between what is a result of the technology itself and like what is intentional representation? What I observed in the images I was seeing was just like Ottoman sultans, part of their faces were black, part of their faces were white. And I wasn't sure at first if that was because of the technology. And to me, because I'm not like I don't know that technology as a modern person. I can't really tell, but for someone at that time, it could be just, of course, it's how the image works. I could only tell because there was this another like picture that was just white, completely white. So I was like, oh, okay, there's some intention behind it. But again, it's still like question I'm trying to understand, and I would love how you're working that question in your research.
Yeah, that's such an interesting example from your own work, and I would love to see some of the prints you're talking about because they sound fascinating. And this question of like Ottomans, Turks, Arabs, like within the sort of black and white binary that print is establishing is also a really interesting and totally complex question. I think that like as far as what you're trying to parse out between what is the technology and what is intentional, a couple of ways that I tried to sort of figure that out is one, the very simple, if you know who the printmaker is or who the publisher is, you can look at their other works and see to what extent there is a continuity or not a continuity, what the quality of the prints usually are. I also generally you can compare it to like other contemporaneous examples within that exact same milieu. So like for mine, it's Amsterdam, mid-17th century. It was the heart of printmaking in Europe in this period. So there were a lot of extremely talented printmakers, and this book in particular was a very expensive book. So I, the publisher wasn't going to cheap out on the printmaker when it was made to like try to suck up to this governor who had come back from Brazil and was very powerful and very famous. So there's a level of sort of trying to parse like the different circumstances around their creation. And I also think I think that generally, if you were a professional printmaker, you're usually pretty good at it. You know, if you got to the level that you were doing it on books, I think that there's a level in which we can assume a certain level of intentionality, mostly because publishers would not have generally been enlisting amateurs. Amateurs who are doing this were doing it on their own time, were printing their own prints, not necessarily working for professionals who are spreading their books by the hundreds or thousands. But it's an interesting thing to think about too, because I don't necessarily want to argue or think that the printmakers were in their head like, I want to racialize these figures, you know, like I want to do this, I want to do that. This is, it's more so to like trying to read between the lines, you know, of like what biases are they bringing to it? What are their experiences with printmaking? What was around them? What did they know about Africans, or what did they know about Ottomans? What other images of sultans had they seen? And in what way is that informing how they are then trying to create their own artistic representation that is also meant to be a commodity? That's part of what's so interesting about prints for me, is that they are fundamentally commodities in a way that some other art objects are a little bit more ambiguous. Prints like these, they were made to be sold. So it's also a way of thinking about like, how are they interacting with the audience? So maybe that is my print historian bias speaking, but I am a believer in intentionality of prints. And your project sounds really fascinating. I saw that Leah dropped the link in the chat, so I'm going to have a look at that immediately after this. And feel free to get in contact with me if you want any sources or anything, or if you want to talk about it. I'd love to.
Thank you.
Leah has a question.
Yeah, this is great. This is a lovely panel. Thank you all for your great papers. I love this discussion of the print medium, but I wanted to ask Elisa a little bit more about her work. And can you speak more about the materiality of these fish skins, what they are like physically, how they can be stored, how they remain today? I just feel like I would love to know more context about the actual objects themselves. Are they represented in images and books from the past? So yeah, thank you. Fascinating material.
Yeah, and as you saw in the presentation, unfortunately, most of the images that you find from the time, they're like the gut skin regalia, which most of the Alutiiq native people would wear. And that's because that was the kind of clothing that they would wear for ceremonial purposes. But the fish skin was, I mean, like the way Nelson put it, is like the poor Alaska native people clothing. So it was not considered quite as beautiful as the gut skin would have been. But definitely, I mean, and also the ones that we have in museums, they're only like from the latest 18th century until 1920, something like that. But it's an incredible material. I mean, it has many properties because it's just able. It's not waterproof like gut skin was, because the gut is like our stomach and it's meant to be waterproof. So, but it really keeps yourself away from the wind. And it's incredible to wear. I mean, like those parkas that you've seen, you can use it for containers, for gloves, tents, all kind of different things. And it's a material that many Alaska Native people are still using. They're still tanning the skins. I've done many workshops with many of the native people that I've mentioned before, and with my students as well. They learn from all the native people the techniques, and it's an incredible material at many levels. Because I mean, if you think like when you eat in the salmon, what are you going to be doing with the skin? So you can make all these incredible things with that as well. Yeah, and as far as the museum pieces, there are many around the world. The most intricate ones are the ones from the Nifka Nanai people in Siberia, because they're embroidered, they're hand painted, they're hand dyed. They have this incredible applique on the back of the garments as well. But all of them, I mean, the Alaska parkas are beautiful as well, and they're just dyed with like mineral materials, and yeah, they're all incredible, and it's fantastic how they're all connected as well amongst them. I mean, so every time I've done much field work with all the native people in different. We went to Hokkaido, and the native Alaska women secret identified very similar pieces, not just with the fish skin, but with the grass socks that they go into the fish skin shoes. So it's fascinating how all these things are connected. I mean, I can go on forever about it. But it's a beautiful material. Thank you for the question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yasmin.
Thank you all for your wonderful talks. I have a question for Brandon, if that's all right. I'm really interested in thinking about passing and racial ambiguity in the pre-modern period. And so I'm wondering if you could tell us a bit more about whether this is a part of like a larger project, because I'm curious about if you've come across any other narratives or examples of this racial passing that's happening. Yeah, I'm just really excited about it because yeah, okay, I'll let you go.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think that this is somewhere like how my dissertation is going to lean. You know, it's something I've been working on for a while with these cases. Most of the ones that we do see are, you know, they are truly from Native American people, Indigenous people from the Americas. And this one is unique. It's one of the only ones that I've found that even mentions somebody trying to pass as Indio. You know, because if they come from the Philippines, they're immediately considered Indios to begin with, and therefore it's not really passing because that was what the term encompassed. But I'm definitely keeping the search out for more passing narratives. What does tend to happen a lot more of the time is you do find people that are born in places like Goa or southern India, which was under Portuguese control, and they're brought to Lisbon, and then they go over into the Spanish Empire by crossing the border from Portugal into Spain. So I think that's kind of a new frontier in the passing of this period that I may start looking into. It might have to go from people that are born within the Portuguese holds at the time and pass into the Spanish Empire, rather than places like China or the Philippines, which were arguably pretty well included, except for this case, which was an outlier. But yeah, it seems like it's a pretty up and coming thing that I'm excited to work on.
Thank you. I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for your research.
Can I ask a question? Sorry, Dave, I just didn't find the function of the raise the hand on the screen, so I just chime in. I have just following Jasmine's question. I have a question for Brandon, and then a quick question for Marianne too. Because Brandon, thanks for your presentation. It reminded me of because you also mentioned the Ricardo Padron, right? And it really reminded us, and we had at Newberry, right, with Leah. We had a conversation with him 2 years ago already in Summer Institute of about European cartography. So my question, maybe it's not a fair question, it's a big one, because he, in his book, the Indies of the Setting Sun, he mentioned how the Europeans depicted the Far East at the Trans-Pacific West, right? So, and you are working with the individual legal documents and cases. So I'm wondering whether in your research right now, you feel this individual writing, even though they are legal documents, have you seen any of them challenge or resistant the more grand practice, European practice of cartography, or they just align with each other? I hope my question makes sense. I will wait, and then maybe I will wait for you. Yeah, I will wait for moments
Sure,
and
sure.
then question. Please.
Yeah, in terms of the cartography, yeah, Ricardo Padron has done a lot with, studying how the Philippines and China and some of the missions that were done within China, Japan, Philippines, even Korea at a certain point were incorporated into Latin America. In terms of the legal documentation, it's very difficult because they all tend to come from different sources. Like this one is from a pleito fiscal, right? Which is it's actually a finance case because, a slave was considered property. And therefore, this is like a case where they're debating the worth of somebody being a slave versus a freed person. Sometimes, I'd like to look more into literature and chronicles, which is what Ricardo Padron does a lot of. He'll look at the chronicles, of people who went to China and then came back and circulated texts through Catalonia and Italy and other places during the early modern period. I'm not entirely sure, actually. I would like to look into some more cases before I give a solid answer and maybe recircle it in the future. But I think the chronicles could hold a lot more than just these individual cases. The cases might affirm it, but I think the chronicles and the literature are what hold more of that broader narrative that he's looking at.
Thank you very much. My question for Marian is that, forgive me if I missed some of your points because it's hard for me to focus all the time. It's a wonderful panel just because of the moment of the day. How would you distinguish the disability and ugliness? I'm just very interested in hearing more. Where is even the word deformed can go either way, right? How would you, or do you want to distinguish them? Thank you.
Thank you, and I'm sorry if I was if it was not very clear during my presentation. I am terribly jet lagged because I actually landed in Italy this morning, and so I'm so sorry for this. Like I really apologize for making a mess of this. But no, I think about your question so much actually because disability as a concept that does not exist for the early modern time. So what I'm doing is using a critical disability studies lens to analyze these sources more than using the category of disability itself. And I have had discussions with other scholars of disability about what does deformity, ugliness, impairment mean at this moment in time, and where do you draw the lines? Because sometimes the sources are not clear. Sometimes, and I mean, I am translating these sources from Italian to English, so there is a problem of translation too. Like I still don't know how to translate some words that mean physically impaired, but also ugly at the same time. So like these concepts sometimes are like hard to distinguish. I think that I hope that in my dissertation I will have more time to reflect upon the vagueness of this language and what we can or cannot infer actually about the actual physical appearance of these people, of these African people from the language that is used by the missionaries. Like sometimes I don't know when the missionaries use the word deformed or impaired, I don't know if they're actually describing a physical disability of some kind, or like if they are just using these words as a metaphor just to describe the African body as something that is other, that is like completely different from their own body, and in doing so they are relying on ideas of deformity and physical differences that come from their own European biases. So ugly and deformed are definitely different, but in the sources somehow they become intertwined. The same way that blackness and deformity become intertwined, and they're not the same thing, but like this is I don't think I have like an answer right now. This is something that I am still thinking about. And I think that what I have landed on is like, I want to understand how bodily differences, whatever they meant to these European actors. So I want to understand how bodily differences were like a very broad concept, that was part of their biases when they were encountering other people. And I don't think that this applies only to African people, but I think other people around the world. And as we have seen from the other presentations, it's very complicated to navigate, and like the lines blur at all times. But yeah, thank you for your question. I don't think I have answered very well, but I'm thinking about it. Thank you.
Great. Are there other questions from panelists or anyone else?
Yes, I also have a question for Miriam, just kind of following up on what you were just talking about. You mentioned very briefly in your paper, like the role that physiognomy plays in these sorts of discourses. And so I was wondering if you could elaborate upon that, because most of my knowledge of physiognomy is, one, not Italy, and two, like 16th century. So I'm wondering, like, in what way are these conversations around physiognomy intersecting around Africans and monstrosity or disability, and how you're seeing that play into your broader research?
Thank you. It's a wonderful question. I think that physiognomy, the way that I have like encountered it, is like as part of Renaissance art. Actually, it also it's part of the Italian artistic landscape, when like you have some, oh my God, I cannot recall even a single name. But anyway, we have Italian artists, let's say, during the 16th, 17th centuries that like whose drawing accentuate some physical features to make a mockery of some people. But sometimes it's not just about making a mockery of some people. It's also because these physical features are so deformed, and they are meant to evoke some sort of moral inner quality. And so like there is this large artistic tradition, this like, and we also have the Renaissance tradition of the grottesco, the idea of something that is deformed but at the same time wondrous. And so, like again, the category of monstrosity, it's double-edged, because something that is monstrous can be horrific but also wondrous at the same time. So it's hard to navigate. And so physiognomy is part of this like tradition of looking at the body and emphasizing some features of the body, and giving them meanings and looking at them as part, as like the exterior representation of some internal qualities. And in this tradition, like blackness itself, like black skin, and other black skin itself is seen as like the external representation of some inner qualities. And like going back to the idea of like disability, which is not a category at this time, but we have people with disabilities that are like drawn and like that are used, whose like features are used to exemplify some quality, which can be usually, I don't know, a laziness or like lust. And so like let's say that this is part of a larger cultural trend that spans the Italian Renaissance, the way that I see it. And so I think it's part of the culture that these Italian missionaries were bringing with them when they were going to West Central Africa. But of course, like I think that it's very important to remember that they mainly adopted a religious lens. And so these discourses have to be linked with the religious meanings that were associated with physical features that were considered as deformed or monstrous. And that's like that's something that I probably need to bring into focus more in my work. Thank you.
Great. Last call, as they say, for final questions, but I know it's been a long day for all of you and you have another full day tomorrow. Leah, did you want to jump in with any.
Yes, thank you all for being here for the whole day. It's been a joy learning from you all. And Miriam, it's amazing you're still awake right now. So you did a fine job, presenting.